Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Victoria Aveyard became an overnight household name as an author when The Hollywood Reporter broke the news that her debut novel, Red Queen, had made her the first author to have her debut novel open at #1 on the New York Times Young Adult Bestseller list. Following this hit up with the equally successful best-selling sequels Glass Sword, King's Cage, and Warstorm, and corresponding novellas Cruel Crown, Queen Song, Steel Scars, and Broken Throne, she just launched a brand new series, Realmbreaker, and joins us today to talk about it all. Victoria, thanks so much for being here.
Hello.
As a child, did you grow up reading the kind of fantasy novels that you write about now and maybe watching those kind of movies?
I was really, really lucky because both my parents growing up were public school teachers. And my mom was an English teacher, and my dad was a history teacher at the time. So the center of that was very much storytelling. So I got introduced to it at a very early age. And I remember my first real foray into storytelling wasn't from books, it was before I could read, it was movies. I went to film school, and that's always been the root of what I do is I really tell these visual stories. I want to put a reader or a watcher or whoever's experiencing it on a roller coaster, because that's my experience. I was 3 years old when I put Jurassic Park in the VCR by myself, and my parents found me watching the T-Rex eat a lawyer, and they were like, she's fine, but is she fine? She's not crying. What should we be more concerned about? And I kind of went from there in terms of telling my own stories. I was very much that kid who would have the other kids over and have very elaborate tales with our action figures and Barbie dolls. And they'd be like, I have to go home early.
When do you first remember beginning to put those stories you were telling orally down on paper?
My first stuff was definitely written in crayon. And it came because my brother had gotten the N64, so it was probably mid 90s, and I was 6 or 7 years old. And he wouldn't let me play, but he would let me help and read the guidebook for Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. And I got so engrossed in the maps in the guidebook, and I started drawing maps of my own. And then I started wondering, well, what's happening in these maps? And that was the first thing when I started telling stories about what was going on in the map world. So I think I was about 7 years old when I wrote that first story, and it was about a princess escaping a prison, and she's with her nurse. And I remember writing like, oh no, nurse fell down and died. Now I must go to sleep. And that's always kind of been my taste since that young age. But I think the first fantasy book I really read and connected to and was like, I love this. I love this detail and level of world building and immersion was Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine. That was my first fantasy book where I was like, yo, I need to do this.
That seems like a message to parents and millennials out there. If your kids play video games, it's not killing brain cells, but actually stimulating them creatively. When you did begin reading fantasy novels, what were 3 or 4 foundational fundamentals that you felt needed to be there for you as the reader, for the world building to be successful and keep you turning the page?
It needed to feel lived in, and there's no tangible way to define this, but it needs to feel real. And I'm very much a details person, but like, I don't need to know all the details, but if I know where the salt comes from and like the trade route of that, I feel like I'm in good hands. And I remember the one world building question I had with Ella Enchanted that I didn't like is that the currency in world was called KJs. And it was never explained to me why the coins were called KJs. And that stuck with me for so long. So now I always try to make everything feel as real and accessible as possible. I think that's where fantasy is really, really successful, when you have a world that is different, but we have our own little touchstones and hooks. So a reader doesn't feel overwhelmed. So like say Song of Ice and Fire, that's an totally complex, detailed, overwhelming world. But then you have a character in the middle of it named Ned, and we feel like we can connect to him. There's Ned and Rob, and like, yeah, their names are actually different. But even something as simple as that can like help a reader along. So for me, it's always about making the world feel like it's something a reader can metabolize. You don't want to intimidate them. You don't want to throw too much at them, but you also want to immerse them at the same time and do it in kind of a sleight of hand way. It's a lot of tricks and shortcuts to make a reader be okay with being pulled into a world that deep, especially on my side of things. I write young adult fiction. So you're already dealing with an audience that has a certain level of attention span, but also they're expecting something different. They're not going to tolerate 100 pages of world building and exposition, and they shouldn't. So you have to figure out the ways to give them this information that is also still moving the story forward. As much as I would love to slow down and describe this door for 2 pages, you can't do that, and it's not going to suit your story. So it's, being very aware of your audience and doing what you can to make them believe.
You wrote some fan fiction in high school. It sounds from some of your peers that I've also spoken to like this is a great way to meet and stay in touch with fellow young authors in the same spot as you are at that point.
Yeah, it's a good encouragement. I loved uploading a chapter at 11 o'clock at night and then waking up the next morning and being like, oh, I got 2 reviews. I'm so excited. Oh, they hated it. Oh, but it's still a review. That kind of thing. And it did give me a thicker skin, I think. But more than anything, it made me brave enough to show anyone else my own writing, because it was sort of, there were no consequences. If I showed the kid next to me my Lord of the Rings fan fiction, the whole school was going to hear about it.
Did you enter USC's world-famous screenwriting program with the intent of becoming a scriptwriter, or did you also have in the back of your mind that you might want to branch out into noveling in years to come?
So I was writing knockoff Lord of the Rings attempts all through middle school, all through high school. I started and abandoned so many stories like that. Lord of the Rings was sort of like the electric moment for me. I was 11 years old when I read the books and saw the movies. I was that demographic, and it became my personality for a very long time. I wrote a lot of fan fiction. I think that was the best writing training I could have possibly had in middle school and high school and a little bit of college. Because especially before I went to college, I had no access to creative writing programs, and I didn't really have creative writing critique going on. English language and literature classes are fine, but you're not exactly being taught creative writing. So fan fiction was the first time I had that experience of someone critiquing my actual creative work. And I really loved it because it was anonymous. And up until that moment, I was so scared of anyone reading any of my work. And that kind of brought me around to the idea of it. So then when it came time to start thinking about colleges, my stupid brain was like, well, writing books and going to college for creative writing to write novels is so intimidating. I also love movies and television. I've always loved those things. I just realized you can also go to school to study movies and to study television and to study screenwriting in particular. I remember the first time I heard about this was I was watching the AFI Lifetime Achievement of George Lucas in like 2015 or 2005. Oh my God, 2005 or 2006. I was 15 or 16 years old. And there was a whole segment where they talked about the USC film program and George Lucas going there and what he learned and all the atmosphere there, the other fantastic entertainers and creatives and storytellers who have come out of that program, Bob Zemeckis, Spielberg tried, that whole situation. And those were like my guys. So I thought, oh my God, I'll look into that. And then of course it ends up being the best program, and there's no way in hell I'm going to get in, which my parents did tell me, we support you applying, but we just want you to be aware that you probably won't get in. And then I did. So it was very much a love at first sight. This is where I meant to be. And I still chalk that up as probably the best decision I ever made, even though, it was a lot of loans and a lot of difficulty going from small town Massachusetts to Los Angeles and a huge university. Total culture shock. Never been around people like that before in my life. Never been around like money like that before in my life. It was so formative and so good for me to learn storytelling, basically at the knee of people who were already fantastic storytellers. Like one of my professors wrote Top Gun, and he would give you notes on your screenplay. But I hadn't really done scripts before I got into film school, and then it was learning structure of story, learning the format of screenwriting, which I think is pretty much the only thing that divides screenwriting from fiction writing. The bones are the same. It's just the way it's written that's different. And then my senior year of college, I was getting ready to go out into the world with a film degree and a bunch of loans in the middle of a recession. And I knew I was a terrible intern, and I knew I would be a bad assistant. And that's kind of the path you take when you're trying to get a screenwriting career off the ground. And I came back around to, well, now I've written 3 or 4 full stories. Are novels still so intimidating to me?
Was that the creative epiphany that got you working on those first drafts of what became the Red Queen? And for fans, how quickly after that did Mayor Barrow's world start to come to life in your mind? One word for viewers who don't know, a key feature is that it's divided by blood, where those with common red blood serve the silver-blooded elite, who also have superpowers. When did you first know you wanted to make Mayor a hybrid of both?
I started thinking, well, I love young adult, I love YA, I grew up in the Twilight era. Maybe that's something I should be thinking about. And an idea hit me while I was there. So I like to describe Red Queen as Game of Thrones meets X-Men meets Hunger Games. If there's something in there that you like, you'll probably like this series. That's how I pitched it for almost 10 years now, which is crazy to think about. But I remember the very first inkling of Red Queen I had was an image. I always start with an image, whether it be an image from the world or an image of the character. And in this case, I was sitting in the student worker office at my desk and I emailed myself 2 lines. And it was about a girl in an arena walking in, and the point is she's going to be executed. And I didn't know why she was going to be executed. I didn't know what she had done. And she's facing down her executioner, who's in like a full plate of armor, and she electrocutes him. And I remember writing down the scene of him cooking in his own armor. And I just loved that. And that, electrified my brain a little bit. And I just started asking myself questions about that moment of who was she? What did she do? Why does she have electric powers? What's going on here? And I kind of morphed it with the whole, I want to come back to trying to write a novel, trying to write what is clearly a YA novel, because this is what I connect to. I'm 21 years old. This is where my heart is. And those things all sort of dovetailed really nicely together. Of course, it then took another 7-8 months before I had that first finished draft, which in hindsight is now very, very fast. But I also had the benefit of, I moved home from Los Angeles. I was living at home with my parents. I wasn't working at the same time. They were definitely cooking my meals. So all I could do was work. And I work really well when the pressure is on, which is a very bad habit of mine. But it ended up going okay. Anytime we have a division in society in fiction, it is definitely reflecting what we feel in our society today. And this book was written predominantly in 2012. If I'm remembering correctly, it was around the same time as Occupy Wall Street. It was around the same time as people were really starting to feel that class division in American society, and that thought that like we are put into boxes and there's no way to get out of those boxes, and the elite control everything no matter what you do. And that feels so antithetical to like the American dream. So I think that's why we react so strongly. And that definitely came through in the work in creating a world that is so stratified and so divided, literally based on the color of your blood. And if you have red blood, you're a normal human. And if you have silver blood, you have evolved to have superpowers and you are part of this upper echelon of society. And then Mare is sort of caught in the middle because she has red blood, but also somehow has powers. And that creates problems for either side. And of course, anytime you have division like that, anytime you have inequality like that in fiction, there is going to be a push against it. And so, of course, that's where the Scarlet Guard idea came from, because, of course, it's human nature not to be held down, or to at least be fighting against what is holding you down. So they became sort of the revolutionaries. And one thing I really did want to make clear is that one man's revolutionary is another man's terrorist. And I grew up in post 9/11 America. That is something that is in the back of our minds all the time now. So I wanted to show a very, very realistic version of that classic dystopian future rebellion situation. I wanted to show the good and the bad on either side, you know, the collateral damage, the people who are part of the problem, but who aren't, you know, murderers and horrible. They just live that way and they think that's how the world is because that's what they've been told too. So I hoped to show all shades of that in a world that seems very black and white.
How visually did your USC training shape the way you wrote Red Queen?
I definitely, I see visually, I think I've never heard it described as touch typing before, but I definitely, you know, look away from the screen and see it in my head and type what I am seeing. Because my background is in film. I studied screenwriting in college, and that's how I was taught to tell a story. So the structure of my stories really breaks down into 3-act structure very basically. Like you can split my book in half and you will see that's exactly the midpoint. Wow. And a reader doesn't notice that, but a reader ingest that really easily because that's the storytelling that we have been taught, and we understand the rhythm of that a little bit more. So the reader can come with you. You don't have to do too much to them to get them to feel those beats, which I really love. But yeah, I see like shot for shot.
Did the title Red Queen appear to you early on as the perfect fit for the story as you were putting it down on paper?
The first draft did not have that title. I figured it out, I think pretty much, I want to say when I was writing the third act. And it not only worked in world because she's red and also part of the upper class, so somehow queen as well. It's, a real nice juxtaposition in world. But there's also the genetic hypothesis called the Red Queen hypothesis, which is that everything is evolving at such a fast rate that it also looks like we're standing still. And the second you stop running, you become obsolete. And that kind of ties in to the sort of way that the superpowers work in the world and the way that mares do, in that people think the reds have fallen behind, they're stagnant, they're lower, they're beneath us, but they are also evolving too. So that was just my little like, I'm kind of smart if you figure it out. If not, whatever.
Along with her control of lightning, what were a few of your favorite superpowers that you gave Mare and the other Silver Elite? We have Tiberius Calor VII, who can manipulate fire, Alara Mirandus, whose power is whispering or reading people's minds, Julian Hakos, a singer who can control people with his voice, Lucas Telemus and Evangeline Samos, all of three who can manipulate metal, Sarah Skonas, who has the power to heal, and of course Rain Arben, whose power is to neutralize everyone else's powers altogether if he wants.
The superpowers were cool because I had to have a database of superhuman abilities. I definitely went through the Wikipedia and saw, telekinesis. Here's all the famous characters who have this, and here's the way it's manifesting. So it was a challenge to find ones that were familiar, but also find my own way into them. I really did like writing the magnetrons, who are the ones who can control metal, like Magneto on steroids kind of thing. And the character who manifests that best is a character named Evangeline, who starts off very much a villain. And I got to follow her arc and get into her POV later on in the series. And she's, not a good guy, but you immediately are like, oh shit, I get it. And I love doing that to my readers. I love being like, you're going to hate this person, and then I'm going to make you not hate this person. But the way that I tried to find my way into her ability is that she can sense different kinds of metal, and different kinds of metal are harder to work with. And she, to train, slept with a bullet around her neck. So she inherently learned what a bullet feels like, so that if someone shoots her without even thinking, she can stop it, and just having that thought of, but how did this power change who they are from a very young age, and what did it make them, was a really fun exercise, but also a lot to keep in balance in your own head.
You kept readers entertained with these superpowers and epic action scenes throughout the series. What are a few key elements that need to be at play on the field of battle, so to speak, to keep the reader really excited to race from one page to the next?
For the action sequences, it was just so fun. I mean, who doesn't want to be able to like electrocute somebody? So getting to write about that was really cool. And a little bit of wish fulfillment, we all do it. But it was also challenging too, because you don't want to overpower your characters. I had a character who could teleport, and it immediately made things really, really hard, because why don't they just bloop away from danger every single time? And I had to figure out ways around that. And eventually you can't just knock him out immediately every time a fight starts. If I'm writing an action sequence, I will usually choreograph it to music so that it has a rhythm and that I can pull the reader through in a way, because those can be really, really confusing on the page when you don't have a visual element. So you're doing everything you can to make them feel like the pulse of what's going on. I do want them to feel like I have given them like the shot list, and they are seeing the angles, and they are jumping from character to character, and they are, every inch a part of that moment. So I do everything I can. I use the visuals, I use the sound, I use the music. One action sequence in Realmbreaker, my newest fantasy series, was written to DMX, and one was written to the soundtrack from Mad Max Fury Road. It just depends on what I have. And I have playlists that I cycle through, and I go for long walks, and I think, okay, I want this kind of scene, and I start listening. And sometimes the song and what I need, they click together, and then you can figure everything out. It's a really weird experience, and it almost feels like cheating, because the music's kind of leading you in certain directions, but it's fine. It gets it on the page.
Great advice. For fans, can you give us a little peek at the soundtrack that you wrote Red Queen to?
That series, was written between 2012 and probably 2017. I remember there being a lot of Florence and the Machine, Sia, and Ellie Goulding on that series. And then there was a lot of like EDM as well. That's also really good for action set pieces. Anything with a really good pulse.
After this book blew up and became a bestseller right out of the gate, that must have felt like a great mom and dad I did it moment after living at home for a year and devoting 100% of your time and talent to the project.
My parents were like, yeah, she's back home writing a book. And everyone was like, ooh, oh no. And parents hate when I tell that story at book events because they're like, God damn it, now my kid's going to want to do that. But yeah, so I was about to graduate USC, and the screenwriting program has something called First Pitch that they do for all of their graduates in the BFA and MFA program. And it's essentially like speed dating night where you talk to 10 agents, executives, managers, assistants, whatever, and you try and pitch yourself and pitch your work. And it was the worst 2 hours of my life. Absolutely. And afterwards, you email everyone you spoke with, you email everyone you didn't get to speak with because you only get so many people and they arrange it based on who they think you'll gel best with. So I sent about 40 or 50 emails. I got one email back saying, we love this idea for a TV show you had. We'd love to bring you in for a general meeting with this management company. And in the meeting, my one general, I was, again, very, very nervous. I pitched TV shows, movies. They weren't really getting into it. And then I said, I also have this idea for a young adult novel. And I gave them like one line about a girl in a world with superpowers who discovers she has superpowers too. And that's wrong. And they were like, okay, that's probably the most exciting thing. Do you think you can do that? And I was like, yeah, I want it to be the next big YA thing. Hunger Games is over. Divergent is ending. Let's do this. And they were like, okay, sure, go write it. So that's when I decided I'm going to move home and focus entirely on this book. This doesn't mean it's going to go anywhere, but I'm going to try. And I think it was a little bit wishful thinking on my part as well, putting all my eggs in this basket. I moved home, and over the next 6 months, I wrote that first draft of Red Queen. And I remember in the middle, I got really, really down on myself and thought, what am I doing? This is terrible. And my dad and my best friend, who had been reading chapters as I was writing, were like, hey, if you're not going to keep writing, can you tell us how it ends? Because we really want to know. It's like, okay, fine, I'll write the rest of the book for you. It was very good motivation. So when I finished, I sent the draft to the manager who I had been sort of emailing back and forth with, but had not been signed by. And he said, great, thanks. I'm not a manager anymore. But I will forward this along to a friend of mine who works at an agency in New York, a literary agency. And I was like, okay, I don't really know what that means. And he said, here's my friend's name. His name is Puya Shabazian. He works at New Leaf Literary Agency. And I was like, okay, this is like an unedited draft, but I guess that's what's going to happen now. And he sent it off on a Friday. I started Googling, realized, oh shit, they're like the real deal. They represent some of my favorite YA authors and books. They're going to hate this. I have no idea how this is going to land. Unbeknownst to me, Puya had received the draft and like my one sheet of what it was, and immediately sent it to one of the two agents at the time who was there. Her name was Susie Townsend. And Susie read it over that weekend. And come Monday morning, after thinking, I will never hear back from any of these people, that book is in the wind. I'm going to have to start researching how to like query and what that means and where I should be going. Susie and the president of New Leaf followed me on Twitter. And I was like, don't freak out. This doesn't mean anything. I just know they know you exist. That's it. And then later that day, I got an email from Susie asking if we could have a phone call about the manuscript. And I was like, okay, now I can freak out a little bit. And in the phone call, she said, you know, I read it in a weekend. I couldn't stop reading it. You sent it in a PDF, not a Word document, which ended up being a good thing because I couldn't check how many words it was. And afterwards, I checked, and it was about 40,000 words longer than I wanted it to be. But I didn't feel it in the moment, which was good. So what we did is she said, I like to do a round of edits with someone before I sign them to make sure that we gel together and we can work well together. So that's what I did. I did a really large machete edit, essentially, where what I took out was really not at all, you know, useful to the plot. The things that came out, I barely remember anymore because the plot didn't change. It was all just kind of fat. And when I finished with that edit and she came back and was like, yeah, great, I love it, let's do another round, but let's sign and make this official. And that was in February of 2013. And in April of 2013, after 2 weeks of submission, which was pretty agonizing. I mean, you understand, you are watching your email just all day long waiting for it to ding. And we had at least 5 rejections. And I did tell her I want to see all the rejections. I want to see what they didn't like. Then the offer came in and it was a preempt and it was like, you have 2 hours to accept. And I was like, what does that mean? Is it a good offer? Because I had no basis on like, what was a good offer? What was a bad offer? Obviously to me, I was like, this is insane. She goes, this is a good offer. We're taking it. So that was, strange. April 2013, the book sold. And in May of 2012 was when I graduated college. So 11 months total after college graduation. And my loans kicked in 1 month later. With the different advance payments, eventually I was able to pay off my loans. And that was still probably the proudest moment of my career beyond, anything. Just knowing that those loans weren't going to be on me for the rest of my life, because if I had been in any other job, I would 1000% be paying those off forever. That was crazy. And it is crazy that like you need a miracle nowadays to pay off your college loan. Like, what's that all about? But yeah, then holding the finished book was very, very strange, because in the one part of your brain, you're like, this is essentially like a child. It took me a long time to gestate this, and now it's real in my hand. And the other part, at least for me, is like, don't get too caught up in it. This is your job. Don't like get too full of yourself. Keep it moving. So that's always interesting.
You next gave fans 2 novellas, Queen Song and Steel Scars, to tide them over while you were working on the second full-length novel. I'm guessing that these were written at the publisher's request.
Yes. The request to do the novellas came after the first Red Queen book came out, and a few months had gone by, and it was very clear that this book was doing really well and it had a fandom, and we wanted to keep that momentum going. And at that time in YA publishing, novellas were very, very popular. So the publisher said, would you like to do 2 novellas? And we'll have them come out this summer, and they'll really be a great thing to hold people over and connect them to the next book. And this had been my first book. I was very much a baby writer, and I was like, yeah, sure. Not really understanding what the scheduling was going to be like, because I was also trying to write Glass Sword, the second full Red Queen book, at the same time to get it out in the next year. So the benefit was I definitely got to know the characters better. I got to know the world better. I got to know the history better. And that really helped me further on in the series. That was never going to be wasted material. Even if it went to nobody, it still helped me as a writer. The challenge was definitely the timing and the scheduling, and not having enough time with the other book. And I think the other book did suffer for that. But I think that was always going to happen too, because they say, the second book is always the hardest, because that's when you find out what it's like for both sides of the job to exist. So Cruel Crown is just the bind up of Queen Song and Steel Scars, so that is very confusing to readers, because they're like, there are 3. And I'm like, no, there ain't. I would know. They're both really cool and really different. So Queen Song is about Cal's mother. So it's a much further back prequel. It's entirely set in Silver Society, and it's written in third person. And it was the only part of the Red Queen series that is written in third person. And I really loved doing that. And then later on, Realmbreaker, the new series, is in third person. So that was helpful in learning where I was suited and what I enjoyed writing. But also just to expand a completely different part of the series that was not lower stakes, but very separate and different and more indicative of the world and the like more royal, glittery world, while also getting sort of like the reality of living in that world at the same time. And like, yeah, they're the bad guys, but also they suffer too. And then Steel Scars was a direct prequel that kind of overlaps with the beginning of Red Queen, set within the Scarlet Guard. So you get 2 separate ends of the spectrum and 2 very different point of views. And again, people who you might not necessarily sympathize with that now you're going to sympathize with, or vice versa.
Who in that spirit's a favorite antagonist that you've gotten to know and maybe even like a little in the course of writing any of these novellas?
I don't want to name antagonists either in Red Queen or Realmbreaker, because they are kind of spoilers a little bit, because I love doing that. I love tricking my audience. Like, that's probably my favorite thing to do, is to trick them, because I think that sets you on a different footing for the entire series, and you're always second guessing everything, and it just becomes that much more of a proactive versus reactive relationship with the reader. But as in terms of writing antagonists that are intriguing to the reader, I gravitate towards villains that I understand in terms of motivation. Killmonger from Black Panther, for example, is I would say probably the best besides Loki Marvel villain, because you see his point and you're like, you have a point, like you're not wrong. Your execution might be, but like I get it. I get where you're coming from here, and that's always really cool because we reflect that onto ourselves and we think, yeah, I could be a villain too if pushed in the right direction. It humanizes them, but it also makes them very interesting to us.
Turning to the second full book in the series, Glass Sword, Mare discovers she's not the only Red-Silver hybrid, but her involvement with the Red Guard grows as well after she escapes from Maven. What else were you excited to give fans in this new book, both in what and who recurred from the first, and then those new elements and characters you added to the fabric of the second novel?
Glass Sword was very much my road movie. So we were developing characters in a way that we couldn't in the first book because now people understand them and know them, so we can push a little bit further. So that book was a lot about building her up and then taking away pretty much everything she felt she had earned. While that was probably the book I feel like I did the worst with, I think that was my best ending. I love the ending of Glass Sword, and I think that cliffhanger launch into the third book, it got a lot of people through the series because they agree with me, like, oh, this book was kind of a slog, but then that ending, I had to go on to the next one. And like, it was enjoyable and just cool to know I was writing a sequel that people wanted. That was really wild. Timeline wise, part of it was written before Red Queen came out and part of it was written after. Like I was in the editing process after. So I was hearing a lot of noise of what people wanted to happen. And sometimes you're like, oh yeah, I'm really going to get them. And sometimes you're like, that would have been a better idea, but I'm in proof, so can't happen now. So that's interesting to tune out. And I've definitely learned to lean into the schedule so that I don't find myself in that situation. But it also, the challenge was the schedule. The challenge was you need another book out in one calendar year, exact same week as last year. And I don't think that's really conducive to good creative writing. And unfortunately in YA, until you reach a certain tier, that's sort of what you're saddled with. There's this narrative that we need to keep our momentum and that readers will forget about us that I don't entirely believe in. But I don't have the stats and I'm not a marketing team, so I kind of trust them on that.
Who are any supporting cast characters from Glass Sword that you most enjoyed bringing more fully into the spotlight, so to speak, in this volume of the broader story?
So the first 2.5 books are all from Mare's point of view, or 2.5-ish. And the third book, because Mare gets separated from a lot of the main cast, that's when I started bringing in the new POVs. Like the story demanded it. And it was really great because at that point I was like, oh my God, how much of her point of view can I write? So, you know, if I'm feeling that, the reader is definitely feeling that. Yeah, so from the germination, though, I think Maven was always the character I was most excited about. He's the one who I would say is the most morally interesting and has the most interesting character. So for me, that's great. He did make me work really, really hard because he has a lot of different motivations going on and a lot of different issues that you have to balance when you're writing them. But he was very much I write chronologically and I always know a scene that's going to be my favorite. And some authors will jump ahead and write that scene right away. But if I do that, I'll never actually write the story. So one of his scenes was my carrot scene through the first book. And I felt like the horse with the carrot on the stick, and that led me through the whole story. But he's definitely the character that I was most excited to write the full arc of, besides Mare.
What does that pressure feel like? And the anticipation of wondering whether this new book's going to perform as well as the first one did?
It's surreal. It's also, this is, you know, you want the pressure, like, oh God, what a problem to have. But oh my God, it is so much pressure to know that like the last book did this. If the next one doesn't do this thing that is incredible, that no book has a right to do, you're going to feel like a failure. So that's fun to carry.
King's Cage and Warstorm mark the third and fourth installments in this long-running saga. With Mare now a prisoner and Maven a king, a major betrayal in the third book by Cal, and love stories interwoven within it all, and a massive war to top it all off with. How elaborately did you map this all out before and during writing? And what sort of surprises bloomed up on the page along the way?
Red Queen was originally sold in a 3-book deal. So the original plan was 3 books, and I had an idea of my basic where I want the characters to end up, where I want Mayor Cal and Maven, my 3 mains, to end up and where. I didn't know how they were going to get there, but I knew the place I wanted to land. And then when I was in the middle of writing Glass Sword and kind of mapping out King's Cage, luckily we were in a position where we could do this, but I realized I can't do this in 3 books. This has to be 4. And when we went to the publisher, they were very happy to do 4. A lot of authors don't get that chance. So I'm glad I got to do it. And I think it benefited the story and benefited the world and really let me expand by the time we were in 3 and 4, because I knew I had more room. I love reversing the characters. You know, they start in one place, they're prepared for one thing, and you're like, sorry, life wants you in a completely different area. So especially for Cal, who had been sort of raised to be the king and would have probably been a good king, like he would have been decent. He's suddenly an exile on the run, learning that being a king in general is wrong, but then also finding out there may still be a path back to this thing he's been trained to want. And that's really fascinating to me. One thing that kind of evolved through the Red Queen story wasn't a theme I set out to explore, but it kind of happened in the writing, was the way that we are affected by our upbringing, by what we are taught to be. And then when we discover, is that a real thing that I want, or was I told to want this? And all the characters have different reactions to that moment. And some lean into it and are like, nope, this is what I meant to be. This is what I was trained to be. I can't be anything else, or I can try. So with a series, I think one of the things you always have to think about is escalation. It needs to get bigger. The emotional stakes need to get higher. The dangers need to become more. So there were definitely moments that I knew I wanted in the series, but I knew I couldn't top. So they were going in the last book. And with the 3rd and 4th book, I could really blow apart the world. And we went from, one person versus one person battle to armies versus armies battle. And I love that. I love that moment. I almost call it like a video game moment, like when you start at level 1 and you beat that boss and it was so hard. And then you come back and you're in the same area again 100 levels later and you're like, God, that was nothing. I love that idea of that journey. So I always want people to reflect back on where we've come from and where we are now. And that reflects in the action set pieces, that reflects in the war that develops, in the political aspect that comes through, and then in the way the characters interact with each other. It's so much deeper and means so much more because of what came before.
How cinematic was it inside your mind as you wrote the climactic battle scenes that readers are treated to as the series wound toward this epic conclusion? And any advice along those lines for aspiring authors?
The first and foremost thing is you need to make it easy to understand. The geography of the scene needs to be established very, very quickly, because as soon as your audience is lost, it's really hard to get them back on track. You never want to lose them, and you never want to lose that thread of belief too. One of my professors used to say, you can get an audience to believe one unbelievable thing. So for Red Queen, the unbelievable thing is humans have evolved to have superpowers, and everything needs to try and make sense under that umbrella, because once you break that thread of belief, you're in real trouble. But I would say I will physically draw out a lot of things. So I understand the geography of the scene myself, and I will usually overwrite too and then scale it back, because I would rather have more versus less. It's nice when my editor comes in and she will say, she's not, playing war games like I am. She's not versed in medieval warfare. Like I had my reference books, that kind of thing. And she won't understand something. I'm like, okay, that's something I need to fix. Or she'll say, this I got already. Okay, great. I didn't need to handhold there. So that's always very valuable to get that second or third pair of eyes on something, because you will always see it most clearly. So the point is to get the audience to see it, 50% as clearly as you, because they're never going to be entirely in your head.
Beautifully put. As you were winding it all down and wrapping it all up in Warstorm, you mentioned that there were some moves you didn't get to make until then. What were a few of the best surprises your imagination gave you in terms of how it all concluded?
I'm a big fan of plants and payoffs. So in the second book, we see that submarines exist. In the 4th book, they come back and there's a battle with the submarines. I was never going to get past that if I had it too early. a city that is in the first book and the second and the third. And we've only seen teeny little skirmishes in it. We've seen, a heist or a kidnapping situation. And then in the fourth book, that city is under siege. You can't top that. I had to find ways to escalate into that final battle moment where the city where a lot of the story has taken place that we've become familiar with gets torn apart. And we are already familiar with the geography. We're already familiar with who's there and who's not and what the different pieces are. I love that.
Anyone, whether they survived or not, you were especially sad to say goodbye to?
I get that question a lot. Like, do you regret or were you sad or did you feel anything when they disappeared? And my answer is no. Because if I did miss them, my sense is then I was missing something with them for the story. If their story is done, I'm like, okay, bye, see ya. You don't service anything anymore. The road has ended here. I'm very clinical about those kind of things. And I felt the same way when I finished the series. A lot of people, they say they cry or they're like, oh, I'm going to miss them. And I'm like, on to the next, here we go. And it doesn't necessarily mean I don't have much of an emotional connection to it. It's just, I don't feel that way about the story. I'm just excited to go to the next sandbox.
What about where Mare wound up specifically at the end of it all?
Yes. And I was really happy because a lot of the time you expect a certain thing for a teenage girl at the end of a fantasy dystopia series. And I was really happy to get her to a place where that was an option, but she was still very much herself and giving herself room and space to heal from all of this trauma, because these books, like, we put the kids through the ringer and then at the end they're expected to like be married and pregnant. And you're like, what the hell? They need some serious therapy first. Like, please go home and hug your mom.
Among the mega fans of this series was actress Elizabeth Banks, who acquired the screen rights and has been in development for some time. Please update viewers on where this project presently stands in that process. And it must have been exciting for you to get to apply your education and skill set as a screenwriter to adapting Red Queen from book to script.
Every author, I think, is like, wow, this would be amazing on screen, just because you want to see the visual element. You want the readers to see the visual element and sort of the definitive version. So that's always a dream come true. The Red Queen film option happened about 2 weeks after the Red Queen manuscript sale. And that's because the entertainment industry keeps a lot of tabs on whatever the quote hot new thing is coming out of publishing. And it's cheaper for them to jump on it when it's a manuscript versus when it's a book selling millions of copies. So they hedge their bets and buy a lot of things and see which pans out. And Red Queen, luckily, was picked up by Liz and Max, Elizabeth Banks and her husband, Max Handelman, who is a producer. They have a fantastic production company. And they believed in it from the beginning, long before the book came out and made any kind of waves. I have believed in it through a very, very long process. And film side stuff, theatrical releases, even before COVID for YA was kind of dying, especially big budget YA. So we pivoted towards trying to make it as a TV show 2 months before COVID hit. And I remember I had one meeting in person with our showrunner before things happened. And she and I hit it off like a house on fire. But over the last 2 years, we've been working on pitching, getting it to a distributor. In this case, it's Peacock, who wants to see what the pilot looks like, that kind of thing. And we've been working on that process. It's been really, really cool to be so involved. When it was on the feature side of things, I was involved script-wise in terms of like giving notes. But this time around, I've been in from the ground floor on everything. I get to write the pilot with her. It's been really, really cool and a learning process, but also like getting that screenwriting muscle back and being like, okay, I'm a little rusty, but I see why I love this. And I see why this is attractive to me in addition to fiction writing. So that's been really, really cool to still have that train rolling, because a lot of things are dead by now. I won't say anything beyond that because I'm not really sure what we can say, but I will say fingers crossed. COVID does slow things down. It has sped some other things up, and hopefully I have more information down the road.
Well, we'll look forward to it. In the meantime, you give fans 3 new novellas to tide them over, with World Behind, Firelight, and Farewell, before turning your creative focus to an entirely different world, that of the Realmbreaker. Did you meet Evan Karain and Emirat first? And how soon thereafter did her troop of companions come walking into your imagination? We have a squire, of course, an immortal, an assassin, an ancient sorceress, a forger, and a bounty hunter among this colorful new cast. All personalities I have to imagine that were fun to bring to life on the page while you were writing.
So depends on how your relationship with publishing, any other aspiring author. But with my agent, we have sort of meetings where we plan out the next 5 years. And towards the end of Warstorm, the final Red Queen book, we sat down and had, what do you want to do next? And we already knew I was going to do the collection of Red Queen short stories, which was Broken Throne, which is partially during the story, before, after, and lots of different lore information. But I said, I had this idea and it sprang from a question this time. And basically, I knew I could kind of go in what direction the wind was blowing me. Red Queen was going to afford me a lot of room with my publisher. They had already offered on whatever I did next, kind of sight unseen, which is awesome. So I started asking myself, well, what do I love and what did I want when I was a teenager? What was I looking for? And I was like, well, I loved Lord of the Rings, but I didn't feel like I could be in that world. That didn't feel like it had a place for me. And so I jumped from that to, well, why don't I try and do something in that vein? What are you thinking about? And my question was, like, what would have happened if the Fellowship went out on their quest and they all died? Like, who is the JV team, or, who's on deck next to come and try and save the world? And my thought was, it's going to be the bad guys. It's going to be sort of like a ragtag Doom Squad that they turn to next. So that's where Realmbreaker kind of came from, is wanting to not go with anti-heroes, but go with people who aren't necessarily the heroes of a fantasy world that's otherwise very tropey and very straightforward quest adventure. Because I wanted to feel like I could be a part of it, and I knew other people wanted to be a part of it too, and that was my goal. I love putting together people who hate each other. So that was really, really fun, and giving them a common goal. And I really did want to, I have, a couple of characters in this book who are teenagers, and then characters in this book who are POV characters who are adults. And it was really cool to like get the adults in the room, and the one person who's like, you named your sword? That's so dumb. That sort of like pick at the tropes moment. And I also really got to do something I didn't get to do in Red Queen because it didn't suit the characters, but I went into this knowing I wanted a really good villain romance, because I love when you have two villains who are like, it's you and me, and we're in this together, and we're going to do some bad shit. And they acknowledge that about themselves. I think that's very exciting for me as a writer and for readers. So that was cool to have a heel turn from a character who we thought was going to go in one direction, and then we discover, oh, she is not going in that direction. I loved doing that. As you can tell, I write to my twist carrot moments, and that was very much one of them in the middle of Realmbreaker.
It must have been a whole different feeling of satisfaction when this new brand was embraced by fans of the first series.
Yes, and I think when Red Queen hit the list, I didn't really understand the process, and so it didn't hit me the way it should have.
Now that you're a series veteran, as you plot this new one out, how far are you already into the sequels? And what can you tell us about any specific titles or twists or turns in the story the readers of this new franchise can look forward to coming up?
So this one is straight up a trilogy. I've pretty much had almost everything mapped out. The third book is probably the one that's most misty to me, but I know where it ends. It's not going to be 4 books. I promise everyone that right now. The second book just went through copy edits right now, and it's coming out at the end of June. June 28th would be Bladebreaker, which is the second book. And that, again, more of a road movie, a lot of the training montages, a lot of the leveling up, a lot of the characters getting on a closer level, the people who hate each other who are now realizing like we have some things in common, while also sort of escalating the villain's journey on the other side of things, and just sort of deepening the world as much as I can now that the readers have some fluency with it. That's always really exciting to me when I know I can say a country on the page and they're like, oh yeah, I know what that is. I love that.
You've been doing some screenwriting of your own too, from what we understand.
My first feature screenplay was a zombie Western, actually. And I loved writing that. I had so much fun with that. It's hard because now that I've gotten sort of the taste of how much power you have over story in novel form, not even just like administrative power, but I mean like craft power. Like I can write anything. And a screenplay is much more controlled. And unless you're Quentin Tarantino, sky is not the limit. And a book, do whatever you want. And I like that freedom. And I like being able to build these huge immersive worlds that will be $150 million movies. But you can't write that in a screenplay without the book to back it up.
In that spirit, what else is coming up on the creative horizon for you in the near future?
I think historical fiction is really, really fun for me. I don't know if I'll ever write it because I'm super intimidated by the level of research, which is strange to say after creating whole worlds and entire histories, but at least it's like mine to make. Whereas in historical fiction, it's like your mistake to make because you can only do so much research and know so many things and you're still going to get it wrong. And that sucks. And I think I might be a little too anxiety driven for that. But I would like to write in the adult sphere for sure. I do have some story ideas that will fit better on the adult side of things. And then I have ones that are YA as well.
It must have been a blast over the last decade to see your books translated into 41 languages around the world. That's what we call a global audience.
It's really cool. And to the layman is probably the thing that is most legitifying about me. Is that a word? Legitimizing. The thing that is most legitimizing about me is when someone's like, oh, you write YA novels, and then they see like 30 different languages of them on the shelf because I have a shelf. That's really cool because I think YA gets looked down upon a lot, and so you have to have those things to back up, like this is a totally valid genre and the readers are valid and the writers are valid and the books do well. And that is always like the coolest thing, to have a kid be like, your books made me want to be a writer, because I know who did that for me and like how much esteem I hold them in. And as a teenager, could not imagine myself saying a word to them. So I know like this kid is not only super cool and driven, but like brave also. It's an amazing thing to feel. But the advice I give is figuring out what you like and what you're good at. And I also think it's really, really important to figure out what you're not good at so that you can figure out your ways around it and how to sort of hide your flaws or use your flaws to your advantage. Again, I do talk about how fan fiction really helped me as a teenager, because it was a sandbox to figure out what I liked writing, what I was gravitating towards, what I wasn't getting from my sort of traditional storytelling, and where I wanted to be. And I think a lot of writers, especially in YA, share that fan fiction background because we are writing for an audience that is kind of shunted to the side a little bit. And I think that's why a lot of people come to fan fiction, because they want more from a story and they weren't being serviced by something. So now they're looking for it.
Victoria, congratulations on all your success. Thank you so much for being here today and for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Thank you.